Dobry wieczór, Slava Ukraini. It's very good to be back in Uku. I'm not going to talk about the terrible problems with Ukrainian healthcare, nor am I going to talk about brain surgery, but I hope you'll be interested in something about artificial intelligence, or AI, as it is called, and its relationship to the study of the human brain. Now, you may have seen recently some very high-profile people like Stephen Hawking, the English physicist who died last year, and Elon Musk, the great entrepreneur, have said that AI is a huge threat to the human race, that artificial intelligence, according to Elon Musk, soon there'll be computers, artificial brains that will render us as human beings redundant and unimportant. And there has always been a deep fear, perhaps among human beings, that one day there will be super intelligent creatures or aliens from outer space who will treat us as we treat animals. We eat them, we keep them as pets, we'll put them in zoos. So how seriously are we to take this? Because it is true that artificial intelligence has started to have a profound, very big impact on our lives, and there is no doubt that artificial intelligence is going to become more and more important in modern life. In China, for instance, they now have, I think, something like 100 million CCTV cameras with facial recognition, so that every move people make in public places will be recorded, your face will be recognized, and then you'll get black marks and good marks for how you behave. So potentially AI could put enormous power in the hands of governments, and there is a question which I will discuss later about autonomous weapons, about robot killers. And these are coming, and these already exist. But I want to start on a more philosophical note. But the other person who has popularized this question is Ray Kurzweil, who is now, I think, the director of research for Google. He is a very successful entrepreneur. He thinks we will all live to 1,000 years old, and we will be able to upload our brains onto computers. And he has popularized this phrase, the singularity. And he says, because I think is rubbish, and many other people think is rubbish, because computer power, which basically is the y-axis, calculations per second for $1,000, computers have become so much more powerful in the last 20 or 30 years that soon the human brain will be overtaken by artificial brains. And he calls this the singularity. And then from then on, we will enhance, we will be connected, human brains will be connected to artificial brains, and it'll be like the second coming of Jesus or something like that. In fact, when you hear him talk, it sounds more like a gospel preacher than a proper scientist. And of course, this is prophecy. This is not prediction. This is prophesizing the future. And as the famous physicist Niels Bohr famously said, prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. And when you think purely in terms of human history, of what has happened in Ukraine, with Maidan, with Russia, with the war, with my own country, with the madness of Brexit, and with America, with the madness of Trump, the future is impossible to predict, in fact. Now, I will start with talking a little bit about brain surgery. I introduced the technique many years ago of operating upon people while they were awake. There were certain technical reasons for doing this. You cannot see it there, but in fact, this woman is wide awake, and I've removed her skull, the part of her skull, though the living brain is then exposed. The brain does not feel pain. The brain creates pain. When I pinch my little finger, it is an illusion that the pain is in my finger. It's not. The pain is an electrochemical event in my brain, all that happens when I pinch my finger is a message is sent to my brain, and my brain says, this hurts. Now, why do I mention this? Because when I operate, I have a microscope. I operate with a microscope that shows a living human brain magnified about 10 times. And attached to my microscope is a video camera connected to a computer monitor, so that my assistants and the nurses in the operating theatre can see what I'm doing, because I'm sitting like that looking into this very small space. And I'll ask my patients, because they're awake, I'll say, would you like to see your own brain? And most of them say no. A few say yes. And in this case, this man's awake, you can't see his face. This is the left side of his brain. This, in fact, is a tumour. You can see that it is a little paler there. But that is the visual area of the brain. Here, the technical terms are left occipital lobe. And the left occipital lobe is responsible for seeing things on the right-hand side of the world and of the body. So I had this man looking, it was the left occipital lobe looking at itself on the television monitor. And you feel there should be the equivalent of philosophical acoustic feedback. You feel there should be a metaphysical explosion in the operating theatre. And of course, there's nothing. And the patient looked at his own brain, looking at itself, and he said, it's crazy. And there is something very strange and very extraordinary in the thought that everything you and I are thinking and feeling in our brains at the moment is a physical phenomenon. It is electrochemistry. So what that means is that what goes on in our brains is subject to the laws of physics. It is, in technical terms, it is computable. And Alan Turing, the brilliant, genius British computer specialist, this was the critical paper he wrote in 1936. This essentially was the point he was making. He was not saying that brains are like computers, but because thoughts and feelings are physical events, the brain is a physical system and is therefore subject to the laws of physics. So in theory, the brain, everything we're thinking and feeling is computable because it is physical, but this is not to say, and many people make this mistake when they think about Turing, this is not to say that therefore the brain is like a computer, although some people say that. These are the people, the so-called transhumanists, who hope they will live forever by uploading their brains onto computers. The old idea that the brain is hardware and the mind, thinking, is the software. But this is nonsense. So, but the point is, it is in principle, because the brain is a physical system, it is in principle possible to build a machine with human-level intelligence. But the question is it likely? Now, how difficult would it be? And this is what I want to talk about. Now, the first question is, what is intelligence? In fact, it is very difficult to define intelligence. In the English dictionary, there's a rather very wide definition. We say, well, it's the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills, which does not really tell us very much. But to actually, when we say we think somebody is very intelligent, we often think, well, there are many different ways in which people can be intelligent. What did Einstein say? Now, Einstein was pretty clever. And even now, I think I have a very good friend who's a professor of astrophysics at Oxford University, and very, very much smarter, much cleverer than I am. And he says Einstein's development, particularly of the general theory of relativity, really was a quite extraordinary intellectual achievement. He says that it was not necessarily that anybody else could have actually come up with this theory. What did Einstein say about his own intelligence? Well, he said the true sign of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination. I very rarely think in words at all. The thought comes, I may try to express it in words afterwards. I never made one of my discoveries through the process of rational thinking. And when we think about it, when we use words, there have to be ideas before the words. Of course, we cannot talk about that because it is before speech. And as the great philosopher Wittgenstein said at the end of his magnum opus, the Philosophicus Tractatus, what we cannot put into words, we must pass over in silence. So the point is, we have no scientific understanding of how physical matter gives rise to conscious experience and feelings. It does. That is the fundamental premise of neuroscience. Somehow, in ways we do not understand, physical matter, atoms and molecules, generate conscious experience. And although we have quantum mechanics and cosmology and the Big Bang, we have a very, very developed scientific worldview. Our scientific worldview cannot even begin to explain where our consciousness, how it arises from physical matter. I find this quite reassuring. The Big Bang, the universe is a huge mystery, but I am an equally great mystery. I am very important. I am as mysterious and extraordinary as the universe itself, and that applies to all of us in this room. Now, the other point about intelligence is intelligence and feeling are closely linked. If you talk to mathematicians, if they have a new theory, they'll talk about the elegance of the theory. It is almost an aesthetic experience. It is not a process of cold, rational calculation. So we don't really understand how our brains work in this way, but there is a complicated connection somehow between our feelings and our intellect. David Hume was one of the greatest British, he was Scottish, philosophers, one of the founders of empiricism, and a famous quotation of his, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions." In other words, our feelings, our emotions, are ultimately, in a sense, more important than our ability to think in a logical, rational way. Now, artificial intelligence refers particularly to recent developments in computers where AI systems can do one specific task. The example most commonly talked about in the last couple of years is DeepMind, which is in fact a British company now owned by Google, and the DeepMind program AlphaGo has beaten the world champion playing Go, and Go is generally considered to be much more difficult than chess. Of course, IBM's Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov at chess some time ago. But the point about AI is it is at the moment, when we talk about AI, we're talking about a computer system that can only do one thing. It can do facial recognition. Another one can do AlphaGo. Another one can play chess. But they cannot do different tasks. So when people talk about artificial general intelligence, which does not yet exist, the idea is that this is an AI system which can do many different tasks. The other phrase people use is human-level intelligence, and that is what all the researchers into AI are trying to achieve, of artificial general intelligence, AGI, which is different from AI. Now, AI started in the 1950s, obviously with the development of computers. One of the famous early pioneers was an American called Marvin Minsky, and they were very confident that computers would soon be as clever as human beings. And they were completely disappointed. They made virtually no progress at all. And one reason was that they tried to code computers with symbolic logic. They thought, well, we as human beings, we think logically and rationally. We will try to get computers programs to be like that. It got nowhere. And then there were what were called AI winters, when all the money and research money disappeared. And even, in fact, in the 1980s, AI was almost a dirty word. And the governments had spent millions of pounds and dollars. There had been no progress at all. But this now has changed. And it's changed not because the computer theory has changed, but because of the miniaturization of transistors and computer chips. You all have heard of Moore's law. Moore's chief executive of Intel, one of the major computer chip manufacturers. And this graph shows how in the last 20 years there has been an exponential increase, as we all know, in the power of computers. And we all know that our mobile phone, 50 years ago, the computer was almost the size of this room, which is now just, think, that size. So what has changed is computers have become much, much smaller. And as a result, they work much quicker. And now AI is largely based on what are called neural networks. Now, I'm not a specialist in AI, so don't expect me to explain all this, but these neural networks are basically a very rough or very simple version of how we think brains work to a bit, but they're not really like brains. But the basic concept is that the input, which is on the left, will then go into these different layers and then feed back on itself. And the input is processed and then changes further input. What this means, to keep it simple, is these systems can learn. They can actually do pattern recognition. They don't think, but they can learn. And this is how they work on facial recognition. Now, they only have a very slight, although they use the word neural, which means brain, they only have a very slight resemblance to true brains, and all they can do is recognize patterns and classify things. It is purely statistical association. They have no causal model of what they are looking at. And you cannot ask an AI system why it has come up with the answer it has. This is one of the anxieties about it. If you have autonomous robot weapons and they decide to kill somebody, you cannot actually ask the computer why it did it, but it does not think in terms of cause. It purely recognizes pictures and patterns and can classify them and then react. So there's no understanding or knowledge. So there is no question of the fact that neural networks are not like how real brains work at all. They can do things much better than we can. I mean, they can do very, very fast, they can compute very quickly, but they can only do each AI system can only do one task. You probably have heard of the Google cat. The Google AI team now have fed they fed millions of pictures of cats to an AI system, and that AI system, using neural networks and backpropagation, can now recognize a cat in a picture. It doesn't know what a cat is. You can't ask it what is a cat or why do you think this is a cat, but it can recognize cats because it has seen millions and millions of pictures of cats. Now, of course, a human child will only need to see a cat probably 2 or 3 times to recognize cats forevermore afterwards. And there is this huge difference between human learning and AI learning. And again, we don't even begin to understand how the human brain achieves this. Now, if you look at this book, was published recently. It's a series of interviews with many of the leading figures in artificial intelligence, all much cleverer than me. And the interesting thing about it is there are many different opinions about the future of AI and the possibility of artificial general intelligence. Some people say it is inevitable, it'll come soon. Ray Kurzweil is like that. But they all say, well, we'll have to have breakthroughs. In other words, we'll have to have unpredictable moments of discovery and inspiration. And of course, just because there has been a steady increase in the power of computers and the AI in the last 20 or 30 years does not necessarily mean it will continue. Just as if theoretical physics, not that I understand theoretical physics, if you read the articles about it, it has made really no progress in the last 30 years. String theory has not generated any provable, testable hypotheses. There is always confusion in cosmology about dark energy and dark matter. So breakthroughs are not inevitable. And again, if you read the interviews with the people who believe that AGI will arrive soon, that super intelligent computers will soon be here, they sound more like salesmen or trying to attract more venture capital. It's very much part of the American Silicon Valley sales talk. Whereas other people, other experts say, well, it's possible, but it's impossible to know when it will be achieved. And of course, one of the main reasons for that is how complicated our brains are and how little we understand about our brains. Now, what are the similarities between brains and computers? Well, you can make it sound very simple. They're input-output devices. We have the input of sensation going into our brains, the brain processes it, and then the output is moving or talking or whatever. And of course, there are lots of electrical switches. Computers consist of millions of electrical switches, and in theory, the brain consists of electrical switches. So when you read some of the more optimistic accounts of the future of artificial intelligence, they make it sound as though really the brain is really not very different from a computer. Now, the reality is, of course, this is quite different. Now, the basic building block of all brains, whether it's a human brain or an animal brain, is a nerve cell. I'm sure many of you know this. The nerve cell is a sort of input-output device. The output is called the axon, and the input are called the dendrites, and these receive electrical chemical stimulation from the axons from other nerve cells, and when there is sufficient stimulation or inhibition of the nerve cell will then fire an electric impulse down the axon. But this is not a simple on-off switch. Although the nerve cell accumulates the balance of excitation and inhibition from stimulation of dendrites, there is a lot of computing we do not understand going on within the nerve cell body before an electrical impulse goes down the axon, and that then triggers a response in other nerve cells. So we only have a very basic understanding of how nerve cells work. And then, of course, it is amazing when you look at the figures. 1 cubic millimeter of cortex, of the surface of the brain, contains up to 100,000 nerve cells, and those 100,000 nerve cells will have 1 billion connections. Synapses are the connections where the axons connect chemically to the dendrites. And again, more figures. So that is called a brain bow. It's a picture of part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is mainly to do with memory and map reading. And it gives you, these are all nerve cell bodies. This is some of the tangle of axons and dendrites. And that's a lot less than 1 millimeter. It gives you some idea of the quite extraordinary complexity of brains. So what are the differences? Well, brains are organic. They're not metal and silicone. They're made of organic molecules, and for all we know, that might be a very important reason why, or explanation for how feeling and consciousness arises from physical matter. Nerve cells are not simple on-off switches, whereas computer transistors are. There are 80 billion nerve cells in the human brain. There are 150 trillion synapses. There are 850,000 kilometers of wiring of axons and dendrites. There are up to 100 neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are the chemicals which connect the nerve cells together. When an electrical impulse goes down the axon, it is connected not electrically to the dendrite, but chemicals are released. You'll know some of these: serotonin, noradrenaline, things like that. Many of the psychiatric drugs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, act on the synapse, on the space, very, very small, only a few microns, between the axon and the dendrite receiving. Up to 100 different neurotransmitters. So there's and the different pathways in the brain of different transmitters. Computers are nothing like that at all. And another very important point, brains come with bodies. Computers don't come with bodies. And there is lots of evidence that both when we are children and with animals, all young creatures, having a body is a very important part of learning. The idea that the brain is like a sort of computer dust in the box, totally cut off from the outside world, is completely false. Brains are embodied. They come with bodies and always have done. In fact, in evolutionary theory, the most likely explanation for why brains developed is they're a way of predicting the future. If you have to move, it is easier if you have a model in your brain already as to what to expect. Rather than have to work out every time you move, you have to analyze what is happening. In fact, there's much evidence, really, that sensation is largely expectation. We only pay attention to sensation if it disagrees, if it conflicts with the model we have in our world. I mean, the way to illustrate that is if you imagine you're going down a staircase and there is one step more or one step less than you expect, and you feel completely confused. Or the strange sensation going up the metro elevator when the steps get smaller. We live in a world of prediction, in a world of expectation. There is a famous marine sea organism called the sea squirt, which is much loved of neuroscience lectures. In its larval stage, or pre-adult stage, it has a brain. It swims around in the sea. It has a primitive sort of brain called a notochord. But when it reaches its adult stage, it sticks to a rock. It becomes like a limpet. It no longer moves. And it no longer needs its brain. So it reabsorbs its brain. The brain disappears because now it's not moving. So the embodiment of brains is probably very important. And there is although there are some attempts in some of the American labs to have AI systems which are built into moving robots, they're a very simple attempt at copying this. And again, brains come in social groups. We learn our relationship as children with our parents is absolutely critical to the early development of the brain. So all these reasons mean that brains are very different. And another huge reason, the human brain uses 20 watts of power. That's one dim, weak light bulb. If you scaled up a computer to the same theoretical size as a human brain, it will be in megawatts of energy consumption. So again, there's this profound difference in the way brains and computers work. Now, there are attempts, very interesting attempts, to create models of the brain. One of the biggest is the Connectome project in America, where they're taking dead brains, slicing them up millions of times into very, very thin strips, and then using computers and AI to photograph all the thin pieces, and then trace all the 850,000 kilometers of axons and dendrites to build a wiring diagram of the brain. Now, even the optimists admit this will take decades, 10, 20, 30 years to do that. Has it been achieved of any other animals? Well, the Allen Institute in Seattle recently published a connectome for the mouse, but not at the level of individual brain cells or nerve fibers, at what we call the meso level of 1 or 2 millimeters. What will that tell us? Well, there is one connectome which has been established for the tapeworm C. elegans, which has 302 nerve cells as opposed to our 80 billion, and it has 7,000 synapses. Oops, that's me not expecting to step. 7,000 synapses as opposed to our however many trillion it is. And they now have a complete wiring diagram of this very simple tapeworm. What does that tell us? Well, this is one of the specialists in the field who has been working on it. It took 20 years to establish the connectome for the tapeworm, although the technology now is much faster. And he said, well, what we have is a sort of bed on which we can build experiments. And many people have built many elegant experiments on that bed, but the connectome by itself does not explain anything. Just as looking at a map does not tell you anything in itself. It is a beginning. It is necessary, we say in English, but not sufficient. So even if, in many years' time, the connectome can produce a complete wiring diagram, and these are dead brains, and all of our brains differ a bit between different people, it is very unlikely we'll be able to carry out experiments on living brains to compare to the connectome dead brain in the way you can on mice or on tapeworms. There are obviously significant limitations to how much we can experiment on our own brains. And then the other big project, which was funded in Europe by the EU, was called the Blue Brain Project, which has been very heavily criticized, where they got billions of euros from the EU, and the idea was they'd build a brain from the bottom up, reverse engineering is the phrase, with lots of computers, and create a brain. In fact, this was very heavily criticized by many, many people in the neuroscience world, and I'm told by friends of mine who are proper neuroscientists that really nothing has been achieved. It was very almost megalomaniac, the idea it would achieve anything. There is a new area now called neuromorphic chips, which are very popular and exciting, where rather than trying to program the software to imitate how nerve cells work, is redesigning computer chips so they actually work in themselves more like living brain cells. But I'm told by specialists in the field, nobody knows whether this actually will tell us very much or not. But there's a huge amount of research going on, and obviously there will be many more discoveries. What did Turing say? Well, Turing was a very clever man. He said, we can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done. And as I said earlier, with autonomous weapons, these now exist. There is a lot of concern and anxiety among people in the AI field that there will soon be weapons which no longer have a human controlling them, and there is a strong pressure that there should be international conventions to restrict the use of these weapons, or to make sure there is always a human being in the loop, as the phrase is, controlling ultimately whether the autonomous weapon kills somebody or not. But on the whole, of course, we all know in human history, new weapons get used sooner or later. And again, obviously now the worry is there is a huge AI arms race going on between China, Russia, and America, developing military AI, and who knows what it will lead to. Some people say, the smart weapons will put an end to war. Well, Maxim, who invented the machine gun, he had said, it will make war impossible. Machine guns will be so effective, there will be no more war. And some people are saying the same about autonomous weapons. But that strikes me as highly unlikely. I started by saying that Elon Musk and other people, Hawking, say that AI is the greatest existential threat to humanity. But actually there are much more serious threats. I know that global warming is perhaps not seen as being very important in Ukraine. But mark my words, this is a huge problem. It's happening. It's no longer prediction. It is happening. Just in the news today, Australia's had the hottest time ever. So there'll be many, many problems. Perhaps in Ukraine, you'll be lucky and the impact will not be too great. But this is a much more serious threat to humanity's future than AI. And there I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Finished. You may applaud if you wish. And I'm happy to talk about anything. You needn't be about AI. Sir, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. No, in my opinion, probably not. And it could be smarter than our brain, just like the way a car can drive faster than we can run. But if you sit in a traffic jam driving a car, it would be wonderful to have an autonomy. You could read a book and the car will go forward like that in the traffic jam. But if you're driving on a motorway, if the AI computer has a problem it doesn't understand, it will have to hand back control of a driver. So the driver must stay awake. So what's the point? If you have the car doing most of the driving, you'll probably fall asleep. And you might have seen the recent the Air France aeroplane crash over the Atlantic from Rio de Janeiro 3 or 4 years ago. Was almost certainly because the autopilot had a problem. It handed over to the human pilots, and the human pilots didn't know what to do. So the idea that we'll have all these cars driving around by themselves, I think, it's a long way away. There is a lot of hype and exaggeration. Obviously, all the car manufacturers have to do it. They're all competing. But whether, in fact, it will really make a big difference or not, I think is uncertain. So functional brain scanning is give you a rough idea of which bits of the brain are more active than other parts. And if you put people in a scanner and get them to learn a little finger tapping routine like that, when they're learning, all of the brain, or most of the brain, is active. But once you have learnt it, then only a little bit, only the motor strip lights up. Because to learn is to physically change our brains. I mean, professional pianists have larger hand areas than non-professional pianists. The brain is plastic. To learn is to physically change the structure of our brains. But there was this story, we don't use our brains. There's no evidence for that. Probably, well, we don't know for sure. There's a so-called cognitive reserve theory, that the more why people who have higher levels of education have a lower risk of dementia and Alzheimer's. There's only one factor among others, and the suggestion is that if you are well educated, as all of you are, of course, in this wonderful university, you have more synapses, you have more connections in your brain, and it takes longer for the battery to run down.
Okay, next question.
Thank you for your talk and for the contribution to Ukraine. My question is, considering your experience in neuroscience, do you think it would be beneficial for someone working in different area, like IT, to switch and start learning neuroscience to contribute later?
Well, there are many departments in America and Europe of computational neuroscience, where AI is joined with neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist. The relationship between neurosurgery and neuroscience is rather like the relationship between a plumber and scientists who study metal, you know. I like reading books about it, that's all. But yes, no, this is a big area. It's called computational neuroscience. I think it's fascinating. I mean, I don't know if I'm not a good mathematician, and a lot of this is about mathematics, but if I was young, this is something an area I would like to work in, because it's so interesting.
Okay, one more little question. So, I'm no computer scientist, but I would like to get back to this topic of not using the whole brain while doing different tasks. Do you think it could be like a sufficient workaround for using less power while using our computers to basically make them mimic this tactic of using different parts of it, different parts of the chip, while doing different types of computations?
I don't know, I'm afraid. I don't know enough in the area to answer that question.
Hi. Can we develop the physical part of the brain? If so, can the love affect this?
Can what affect it?
Love.
Love?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's been fairly well shown that being passionately in love lasts about 6 months, you know, and then the hormones and everything else sort of calm down. I said the brain is a physical system. When we learn something, we are changing our brains. When I was a medical student 40 years ago, the theory, the orthodox view was that you were born with a fixed number of brain cells and then they steadily decline as you get older. It's now generally accepted there is much more possibility. It's called neuroplasticity, that even after strokes and head injuries, there is some possibility for the brain rewiring itself and recovering. But the point is, of course, thinking is a physical process. 25% of the blood from the heart goes to the brain. And brain surgery is mainly about stopping bleeding. When you operate on the brain, bleeding is the number one, the big problem. And that is why studying and using the brain is hard work. You're actually physically working on your brain.
What do you think of IQ tests?
This is not. I'm not a psychologist who does this sort of work. There's lots of arguments about IQ tests, of course, and it's interesting that in the Western world, IQ has been increasing for many years, but now has stopped, and there are lots of discussions about this. I think there is from my understanding of the literature, there is a connection. Kids who have high IQs tend to be more successful in later life. But I don't think there's anything stronger than that. And of course, the other issue is all this question of race, and Jim Watson, the DNA man, he's demented anyway. He's got into trouble because he's a racist. But I think there is this quite clear evidence that race is irrelevant, and that race is not really a scientific concept at all.
Okay, Dr. Marsh, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I didn't understand everything as well.
I didn't understand it all either, so don't worry.
So I'm a doctor as well. I'm a pediatric cardiologist, and my professor really asked me to ask you a very unrelated question today, because she couldn't make it. So I'm sorry, but I really need to ask you about your experience with vein of Galen pathology, because we currently have 2 weeks neonatal
cardiac failure
with the right heart condition.
Well, I mean, this is a condition where some babies are born with a short circuit in the circulation in the brain, where arterial blood from the heart is pumped directly into the veins. And it's one of the rare causes of what's called high output cardiac failure. It's a difficult problem. I mean, the modern treatment is mainly endovascular, if possible. Certainly not surgical.
Could I please show you the CT scan later?
You could. I would have to send it to my colleagues in London who know more, who specialize in these areas.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Sorry for bothering.
No, it's all right.
So thank you for this lecture. It was really interesting, and I was just thinking while you were presenting this lecture to us, I tried to be a bit pessimistic about artificial intelligence, or it was just an impression, or just trying to be skeptical.
I'm skeptical about the idea there'll be human-level intelligence in AI in the near future. And to speculate, is it 20 years away, 200 years away, is meaningless. It is just, we cannot predict the future.
But why this interest, in this field? And you're delivering a lecture about this.
I just find it so interesting.
Okay.
I hope I conveyed a little bit of that. I've always found the brain very interesting. It was part of my medical student studies I find most interesting. And I find the phenomenon of my own consciousness just extraordinary, and the fact we don't understand it. And I find that very, very interesting.
Okay, thank you. And just one little question more. Will we have another book of you?
Well, the answer is that I stupidly signed a contract for a third book. I was offered a very large sum of money. We call it a publisher's advance, because the problem is if you write In fact, both my books have been bestsellers. The first book, if you allow me to boast, has sold well over a million copies worldwide. My publishers know, however bad a third book will be, we'll still sell enough copies for them to make a profit. So I said, no, I don't want any money. You can give me money if I finally actually produce a manuscript. So no, I like writing, but I need to have something I like writing. I write for myself, essentially. And I hope I'll find something which I want to write about, which people might find interesting as well. So yes, I am writing a bit again. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm writing more about Ukraine, actually, because I've had some interesting conversations the last few days when I was in Kyiv.
Hello. My question is about spiritual sphere, I guess. So can you try to explain from the scientific point of view what happens to a human brain while people meditate and get into this transcendence condition?
People have put people in functional brain scanners when meditating. I don't think there's very much hard science known to it. The point is we have very limited access to our brains. So we can't look in our brains and see clearly what's going on. Quite a lot of work has been done on meditation, but I don't know whether there are any conclusions to be drawn from it. I don't know. Oh, it's safe. Oh, it's perfectly safe, yes. I think it's perfectly safe, yes.
I would like to know your opinion on brain-computer interfaces, and
that's an interesting question. Brain-computer interfaces is when you put little electric wires into the brain or on the brain. And there are various, there have been some famous examples, much publicized. There's a man in America who was completely paralyzed from the neck down, and they put some electrodes in his brain, and he was able to control the computer just by thinking. You have to train people. A lot of work has been done like this with monkeys, where monkeys learn to move a robotic arm just by thinking, presumably the monkey is kind of imagining moving the robotic arm to get a reward, to get some food. The problem is, firstly, you get inflammation and scarring called gliosis around the electrodes, so they don't always work for a long period of time. And secondly, the number of electrodes compared to the scale of the brain and the millions of brain cells is limited. Another sort of computer brain interface is called deep brain stimulation, which is a therapeutic procedure used for diseases like Parkinson's disease, where you put electrodes directly into parts of the brain. But again, the tip of the electrode is, I think it's about 2 or 3 millimeters. And as I said, 1 cubic millimeter of brain contain up to 100,000 nerve cells. So there's a big mismatch between the size of the electrodes and the size of the brain. The idea of the science fiction idea that you'll have a little slot behind your ear and you take your USB stick and plug it in, and the whole of the Encyclopedia Britannica is that's nonsense. That's pure science fiction.
Good evening, my name is Zach, and I'm a 6th-year student in Lviv National Medical University. And this summer I'm starting my internship in neurosurgery. Mm-hmm. So what are the most important things at the beginning of neurosurgical career? And in your opinion, what should your young colleagues, for example, medical students, to do and to avoid at the beginning of the career? Thank you.
I was talking to one of the deputy ministers of health in Kiev 2 days ago, and we were both agreeing, I'm afraid that the only way you're going to get modern medical training as a postgraduate is to go to Europe or America. The state of postgraduate, this is something I'll be talking a bit about my lecture next week. The state of postgraduate medical education in Ukraine is terrible. I mean, there are always exceptions. There are some examples where there is some postgraduate training beyond the Soviet model of the professor and his son, but on the whole, the training tradition in Ukraine is still the professor and his son and nobody else. When I've had Ukrainian trainees coming to visit me in London, they're always amazed at the difference between the relationship between young doctors and senior doctors in Ukraine and in Europe and America. Ukraine, for reasons, historical reasons, you can't blame the Russians for everything, but you can blame them for a lot of things. I'm afraid a lot of medicine has lost a very, very important part of the medical tradition, which is teaching, just almost as important as treating the patient itself, particularly for senior surgeons. But for all the reasons of economic competition and corruption and this, that, and the other, not enough senior doctors in Ukraine are properly training the next generation of surgeons. And they're no easy, it'll take a long time to change that. There are many good training courses in Europe. They're expensive, of course. I know the Minister of Health here is trying to think of ways to encourage young Ukrainians to get some of their training in Europe and then come back and bring their better knowledge. But it's a big problem. It's not easy.
Okay, we have a question from your previous yesterday lecture from Kyiv. Hello, my name is Dasha, and data scientist from...
What was the lecture yesterday? I've forgotten.
No? It wasn't yesterday? From Kyiv.
I'm joking.
Thank you for your lecture yesterday. Unfortunately, I didn't prepare a good question for it, so I wanted to ask you using my last chance. My question. The human body is not eternal. Continuously updating its part would lead us to immortality. It's too expensive, or is it hard to perform? I heard that you think that it's impossible to place our minds in a digital space and to continue living there. What are the main obstacles to make it done?
Well, that was the subject of my lecture. No, I don't. I know there is this, some people, they're called transhumanists, and they think they will live forever, they'll become computer programs. But there's nonsense. There's no justification for that at all. I mean, the interesting thing, which in some ways is slightly frightening almost, that it may be possible to develop drugs and nerve growth factors that will reverse aging of the brain or increase new synapse formation. We all know that as children we have this fantastic ability to learn foreign languages, which we lose when we're older. One of my biggest regrets in my life is my mother was German. She was a political exile. She had to leave Germany because the Gestapo, the Nazis, were chasing her. And all my family speak German apart from myself. And I'm a passionate internationalist. For me, Brexit is a terrible tragedy and disaster. And I feel terrible. I only speak English. I also wish I could learn Ukrainian. And although I've been coming to Ukraine for 27 years, I've made really no progress at all, other than saying Slava Ukraina. But children have this ability, and we don't really know what the physiological basis of that is. It's probably about being able to make lots of synapses, lots of connections, although at the same time, in fact, interestingly enough, part of learning is pruning. It's called synaptic pruning, like you prune the branches of a tree. You cut little branches off to make it grow better. And an important part of brain development is actually getting rid of synapses as well as creating new ones. But it seems it is possible that drugs will be developed which will facilitate learning and things like that in the brain. But in terms of aging of the body as a whole, all the major organ systems age. Although there are these people, mainly in California, who think they'll do research and live forever, they're not making much progress at the moment. I also think it will be a disaster. If we all live to 150, 200 years old, the world will be a very boring place. What about all the young people? If all these old people are consuming all the resources and everything else. I think death is very important. We all have a duty to die in a decent way at the right time.
Thank you.
Hello, I have two questions. So the first one is, given the combination of the current tools, economic leverage and the human desire for higher abilities, do you think the coming of the AGI is unavoidable? And the second one is, if it is unavoidable, do you think that the symbiotic coexistence of AGI and human species is sort of the modern utopia?
Well,
that,
as I was saying in my talk, in theory, artificial general intelligence is possible because the brain is a physical system. But if it is possible, it is not in the near future because we understand so little about our own intelligence and about how our brains work. Now, it may well be that artificial intelligence will develop in a totally different way from human brains. There may be a different sort of, just like, as I said, with neural networks and backpropagation. Well, we don't think that, so it's complicated actually, because do brains use algorithms? And there's been some very interesting work published just this last year in America by a woman called Doris Tsao on facial recognition in monkeys, using electrodes implanted in the monkey brains and recording. And it seems that in terms of facial recognition in monkeys, and probably the same for humans, in fact it is algorithmic. You have about 50 different features which then code how to recognize faces. So there's some evidence that some aspects of brain function do work like computers, like algorithms. But that is only, scratching at the surface. That's a very small part of understanding how brains work. Personally, I don't think there is a need as such, but it's science. It's interesting. Well, I think that's very unlikely. Personally, I think it's very unlikely. Unlikely. Very unlikely. I think in terms of probabilities, not in terms of yes or no. I see no evidence at the moment that that would be possible.
It sounds like you have some special sympathy or sentiment. I'm here. Some special sympathy or some sentiments towards Ukraine. Can I ask you about the reasons?
Yes, I'm often asked that. I came here by chance in 1992. I saw a country in chaos. I studied, I should explain, before I became a doctor, I studied politics and economics at Oxford University in England, and I specialized in Soviet studies, although I don't speak Russian. I was always interested in Russia. Ukraine's not Russia, don't get me wrong, but I was always interested in Eastern Europe, partly, I think, because of my mother and my German heritage. And my parents were among the people who founded Amnesty International. So my family background was very much one of internationalism and trying, we are here to make the world a better place. We're not here just to drive bigger cars and have bigger houses and go on expensive holidays. It was clear when I came to Kiev in 1992 that this medicine, healthcare was in a terrible state. At that point, I didn't understand all the organizational problems of healthcare, but I could see that at the microscopic level, at the work face, that the equipment was terrible, the education was terrible, and I met this very energetic young surgeon, Kurelets, whom I worked with for many years. I'd helped him, I gave him equipment, things like that. We are no longer colleagues now. It's a sad story. If you know, but it's a very Ukrainian story, if you know the great novel Animal Farm by George Orwell about the animals who stage a revolution and throw out the human beings, and the revolution is led by the pigs. And by the end of the story, the pigs it's a story about Stalin, of course, and the Bolsheviks. And by the end of the story, the pigs are just as bad as the original human beings. And I thought I was helping this very brilliant young surgeon, and he is brilliant in his own way, to rebel against the autocratic Soviet-style professors But after 20 years, I realized he'd become a Soviet professor himself, which often happens with revolutions. They turn full circle. But I'd come back before Maidan. I'd come back to England and tell people, Ukraine is a very important country because it is this watershed, it's this meeting area. There are no mountains other than down in Crimea. So it's been as a battlefield for thousands of years. And it's where Eastern despotism meets European freedom to a certain extent. And after Maidan, after Euromaidan, when the world suddenly realized that Ukraine was very important geopolitically, I said, well, I told you so. And I kind of sensed that. And I like coming, I like the country, I like the people I meet here. And although there are lots of problems, it's the old cliche, every difficulty is an opportunity. And what has particularly impressed me on this visit, I've been coming here for 27 years, really for the first time now, when I was at the Ministry of Health, and I think there have been 18 ministers of health, something like that, since 1992. I think there's a real attempt to make, I know Dr. Saprun has many enemies and many criticism, but there is a real attempt to actually make real reform and progress in healthcare. But the problem about changing things is, first of all, again, the cliche, change is difficult, and there are always winners and always losers. There are always going to be people who lose out. As I hope you know, the ministry has achieved millions of dollars in savings by improving procurement to cut out corruption in the ministry itself, and by putting out procurement to outside organizations. But people have lost out. A lot of corrupt bureaucrats are making a lot less money. And again, this paradox that you all have to, because doctors are paid so little in Ukraine by the government, therefore, inevitably, doctors have to be paid by their patients and families. But paradoxically, in some ways, many doctors prefer that, because they're paid a little, and they can say, oh, I need the money, and it's all under the table, there's no regulation. How much money do you pay? And just today, I've seen a case of a woman with a small brain tumor, which absolutely does not need treatment. They do not grow, and if they do grow, they grow, and it's not causing any symptoms. It has been discovered by chance, and she has seen a surgeon who says it has to come out $3,000. So in many ways, paradoxically, many people, some doctors benefit from the corrupt system you have here. In Poland, 30 years ago, I think the medical system is pretty similar to here. In Poland now, it's solved. When you go to a Polish doctor, he does not ask for money. The patient does not expect to have to pay money. So if they can achieve that in Poland, why can't this be achieved here in Ukraine? And the answer to that, of course, is there are powerful, we call them vested interests, who will lose money if you actually introduce reform. I was very impressed by Dr. Saprun, very impressed indeed. I think they're trying to do great things. But it's going to be very difficult, and to change the medical system, the healthcare system here, is going to take many years. There's a great quote, which I quoted in my lecture yesterday in Cave, from the American writer H.L. Mencken. For every complex problem, there is an answer which is obvious, simple, and wrong. And the healthcare problems in Ukraine are very complex, and it's going to take a long time. You can't expect any quick, instant solutions. But they've made a start, and they made a start at the top by trying to reduce the amount of corruption in the government itself. And I think that's fantastic.
Okay, I have two questions. First one, what are the main functions of brain? If taken in general, you have mentioned that brain evolved to make better predictions.
Well, probably, yes, it's a theory.
May I say that this is a general function number one, or other like that? And second one, in a book of Jeff Hawkins on intelligence, the author states that one of the main ways of brain to operate, let's say, is store and restore the sequences of entities, numbers, objects, events. Will you agree on that?
I don't really understand, I'm afraid, sorry. I don't quite understand the question.
Okay, Jeff Hawkins in his book told that one of the main ways of brain to operate, let's say, is store and restore number of entities, like numbers.
Well, it's memory, yes. Memory is, to have a...
would you agree on that?
Well, yes, I mean, to have a model of the world, it means memory. You know, you have to have a model of the world, it means you have to remember things. There's this famous experiment done on London taxi drivers. This is before Uber. London taxi drivers have to pass an examination called the knowledge. They have to know every street in London, every one-way system, all the quickest ways from getting from A to B. And it takes 2 or 3 years of memorizing this. And you see these young men on motorbikes with a clipboard on front of the handlebars. They're memorizing all the streets of London. And one study, they put London taxi drivers in MRI brain scanners and showed the hippocampus, the memory map part of the brain, was bigger in London cab drivers than the non-cab drivers. So yes, the memory the brain is an information storing device, yes. So I agree with that.
When are not we human doomed or fated to live our life knowing that all our thoughts, our dreams and our personality is just some events that happen, some process that happens in our brain, and what is the general purpose of human's life in this case?
Well, I would take away the word just. I mean, I think many people think that to say thinking and feeling is a physical process means we are machines or like robots. I would say no, what it means is we do not understand physical matter. It doesn't degrade thought and moral judgment. Instead, it elevates physical matter into something we don't understand. Now, I don't think the electricity and the lights is thinking or feeling. Nevertheless, it is an extraordinary mystery. So I don't think accepting that thinking that thought is a physical process, I don't think it weakens the importance of morality or ethics or thinking in any way at all. It is just an extraordinary fact which we don't really understand.
Okay, do we have microphone on this part of hall?
One? Yeah. You mentioned today Einstein and the rational thinking and the words. Do you believe that people can learn, maybe with the help of the artificial intelligence, new way of expressing their thoughts? For example, with images or like new language of communication?
With AI as it is at the moment, no. AI at the moment is very simple. As it is just pattern recognition symptoms. It's a useful tool for recognizing faces, for maybe driving a car. But at the moment, AI is not having it. It's not going to help us learn or think or anything like that. Not at the moment.
Do you have any personal theory on the origin of the consciousness and the evolution?
No, I don't. Not at all. The problem is, of course, you cannot. All science is based on experimentation, and you cannot experiment on consciousness because the only consciousness we can observe is our own consciousness. It's the old joke. I cannot. For all I know, you are all robots. You know. There is an extraordinary neurological condition named after the French doctor who first described it, called Capgras syndrome, Capgras, C-A-P-G-R-A-S. And this is very rare, but it happens in people who have usually had a head injury or sometimes a stroke, and they are convinced that everybody they know are actors or robots. They're not the real people. So if you have a man who says, "This is not my wife, you are somebody pretending to be my wife." And we now know that the reason for that is actually quite simple in neuroanatomical terms, that the connections between the facial recognition areas, which are the undersurfaces of the temporal lobes sort of behind the ears. The connections between the facial recognition areas and the emotional system, called the limbic system, have been damaged. So when you see somebody, you recognize them, but there is no emotional response. And therefore the brain, therefore you say, well, it must be an actor, it must be an imposter. And that's a bit of a side thing, but it shows how sometimes what seem to be very strange psychological phenomena can in fact be understood by reference to an obvious physical thing. But you can't experiment on consciousness. If you take a drug to alter your consciousness, your ability to record what's going on will diminish. So it is an entirely subjective phenomenon, and you might even say it's not a subject for scientific study.
So self-awareness in the animal kingdom is sort of not the same as consciousness.
Well, we don't know. We don't know. I mean, I'm English. I love animals. I assume animals have consciousness of a sort. But what it's like, we don't know. There's no way of telling, and we don't know at what point consciousness arises. Is it that each individual brain cell has a sort of millionth part of consciousness, or is it that certain groups of brain cells generate consciousness? There is much interest at the moment in certain cells in the brain called von Economo cells, spindle cells, which are connected differently from other nerve cells. And people suggest, well, maybe that is to do with consciousness. But you cannot operate upon people and remove these parts of the brain. It's ethically not acceptable. So my own view is a major reason why there'll be less progress in trying to understand our brains and also develop artificial intelligence is that actually we are very limited ethically on experiments we can carry out on ourselves. We can experiment on animals, on poor monkeys and chimpanzees, but they can never tell us what they're thinking. So progress will not necessarily go on and on and on all the time.
I offer 3 more questions. Okay.
Hello, I'm here. My question, sorry if it's ignorant, but still. One of the new developments in cancer treatment is treating with a person with his or her own cells.
Yeah.
Is it also used for brain tumors and cancer?
No. You're probably talking about something called CAR T cell therapy, where you take the T lymphocytes out of the patient's blood. You then, in the laboratory, in vitro, you train them, in effect, to kill the particular cancer cells. You then grow them in culture. You start maybe with a few thousand T lymphocytes. You then alter them, you genetically modify them, usually with a virus, and then you put them back into the patient. It only really works for leukemia and maybe lymphoma. It doesn't work for the solid tumors, although experiments are being... It's a very new treatment, and it only costs $500,000 per patient. And I was being told at the Health Ministry this week how the drug bill in Ukraine is dominated more and more by these cancer drugs. Cancer drugs are so expensive. And it's a big problem all over the world how much these drugs cost. And they also have very difficult bad side effects. The CAR T cell therapy, you get cytokine release syndrome, which is a very, very serious side effect. But it does cure some people who before were not cured.
So is the only way to treat brain cancer is surgery?
Brain cancer, we have really made virtually no progress in 50 or 60 years. The treatment of brain cancer, which basically means, well, primary, when it's a tumor growing in the brain itself, glioblastoma, its treatment is partial surgical removal, radiation treatment, and a very simple sort of chemotherapy called temozolomide. And the survival figures are no better now, really, than they were many years ago, alas. If there is a solution to brain cancer, it will not be surgery. It will be some kind of different and non-surgical treatment.
Hello, thank you so much for your lecture.
And I'm sorry for going off topic yet again, but I just have to ask this question because a friend of mine is texting me from Hong Kong. She has been diagnosed with dual arteriovenous fistula.
Yep. Okay.
And I'm not a specialist, but hopefully friends will help me. So
well, the treatment for those, well, all these things are complicated. The treatment for that usually is endovascular treatment done through blood vessels, but in certain cases it's surgery. I mean, they're usually fairly simple treatment, simple surgery.
Yeah, she was recommending not to get surgery, and she is kind of concerned about that.
Well, it depends. It depends on the particular pattern. There are many different forms of dural AV fistula. I can't give an overall. Treatment is either surgery or endovascular treatment, but some cannot be treated endovascular, depending on the exact anatomy of the fistula and where it is.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
I would like to ask, people say that they're, like, at school people ask, are you a hearing learner or a visual learner, for example. When somebody has, problems with eyesight, or like, for example, they're blind or deaf, does it mean they, for example, if a person is deaf, does it mean their eyesight is better?
Yes, it does. It does. If you can do an experiment with normal people, if you blindfold them so they cannot see, and then you put recording electrodes over the back of the head, within about 48 hours, the visual parts of the brain that usually analyze vision start analyzing sound. And there are some famous examples of blind people who are born blind. There is one boy who has learnt to echolocate like a bat. He makes clicking sounds as he walks, and he can tell by the way the sound bounces off buildings around him where he is. So this is an example of neuroplasticity. It doesn't apply to everything, but yes is the answer. Particularly if you're born blind or if you're born deaf, other abilities will become stronger.
I actually have another question. When baby is born, I heard that their eyesight is like flipped over.
Well, eyesight's flipped over normally anyway, and the image on the retina is upside down. And the image I've got of you in the back of my eye is that way round. You can put spectacles on people which turn everything upside down, so they see upside down, and they, like that. Within 2 or 3 days, they see normally. The brain has unscrambled it. And then you take the spectacles off, it's all upside down again. The brain has this extraordinary ability to want to sort things out. I have had surgery on my eyes, and I have an artificial lens in one eye. And if I look at the focal depth of my left eye is different to my right eye. If I look at the moon at night with one eye, it's quite small. With the other eye, it's bigger. If I cover one eye at a time. But when I look at the moon with both eyes, my brain sorts the problem out, and I see one moon the same size.
Thank you.
Okay. Almost the last question. Good evening, Sarah. Thank you for coming. So I would have 2 questions for you. One is...
that's cheating.
I'm sorry. Well, the second one came
all right,
by herself. So that will be the first one. Do you believe, as a person involved in medicine, in this conspiration theory that there is actually a treatment for cancer, but it is hidden in order to make money?
No, I don't believe that. Cancer is 1,000 different diseases. Although we use the word cancer, there are many, many different types of cancer. And the fact of the matter is, on the whole with doctors, if treatment works, it spreads very quickly. Now, actually, most doctors, maybe not in Ukraine, but I'm sure that's not the case, most doctors actually, we like curing people. We like helping patients. And surprise, surprise. And if treatment works, it is usually adopted very quickly. But the problem is many cancers still cannot be treated or they cannot be cured. It is particularly, you see this most movingly with children. I still, when I come to do clinics here, I will often see patients with fatal brain tumours. And my own son had a brain tumour, so he survived, we were lucky. But I understand what it is like to have a child whom you think is dying from a brain tumour. There is nothing more terrible. And these parents are desperate. And so many of them, when I'm in Ukraine, will come to me with pieces of paper they've downloaded off the internet. There's particularly a clinic in Mexico, which for $30,000, as a first payment, says they will use intra-arterial chemotherapy. And the parents are so desperate, they will take any chance. These people are very vulnerable. And I'm afraid many doctors are very greedy, and they will exploit the anxieties. And they'll say, well, you know, there's a famous saying in English medicine, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So in other words, you could say with intra-arterial chemotherapy, well, we don't have any evidence it works, but we don't have any evidence it doesn't work. It might work. Give me $30,000 and then we'll treat your child. In fact, with intra-arterial chemotherapy for this particular tumour I'm thinking about, it doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. There is good scientific evidence it doesn't work. Trials have been done. So when people start talking about conspiracy theories, no, it's not the case.
So if I can, okay. So some time ago in China, they were planning to transplant a head.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
This is an Italian neuroscientist who, for some reason, wants to do head transplants. Personally, I can't see the benefit, though there is some poor Russian who's got some progressive paralysis who wants to be the first patient. Technically, it is possible. You have to connect the major blood vessels between the body and the brain, which you can do. You have to connect the skull to the spine with metal rods, which you can do. And then you have to cut the spinal cord. And then you have to hope it will grow back again. Now, the basis of all experimental medical treatment has to be animal experimentation. So obviously, if you want to do head transplants in human beings, you need to show it is possible in animals. Not a nice thing to do, and this Italian and the Chinese have not done that. There's no good peer-reviewed scientific evidence that people have. Yes, there was some crazy Russian who did a dog head transplant, but they don't die. You know, they're on ventilators. Because if you have a head transplant, you'll be totally paralyzed. And then you could also say, well, is it really a good idea? Does society need this, even if it's possible? But I think this is nonsense. There is also a further point. There are two nerves called the vagus nerves, which run from the brain outside the spinal cord. And we don't really know what would happen to the body if the vagus nerves do many important things. There is no experimental work as to what happens if you cut the vagus nerve. But the critical question is on spinal cord recovery. And the technique this Italian man recommended is completely unproven. Right.
Okay, the last question.
Hey, right, another one.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the very interesting lecture. And for my question, some times ago I watched the advertisement about the device to mend the mood. For example, when you are very sad or scared, you just plug in the device, it sends some electricity signal, and you're going to calm down. So for your opinion, how effective is this type of devices for people? And if it's really effective, maybe how ethical is to use them? And maybe you need some special regulation for this type of devices.
Well, I don't know about this device. I mean, well, the answer is for severe depression, there is some deep brain stimulation techniques you can use, where you stimulate electrically the undersurface of the frontal lobes of the brain. It's a form of psychosurgery. And it does work for some. There've been there's contradictory evidence, but there is some evidence that DBS, deep brain stimulation, can work for severe depression, which is a bit different from making people happier. It's treating severe depression. But I'd finish by quoting Einstein again. I mean, severe depression is a different thing. But Einstein was a very clever man, as you know, and he said the best way to cheer yourself up is to cheer somebody else up, you know? And that's a good technique which I would recommend.
Thank you.
I should congratulate you all on your excellent English. I'm most impressed. It's so much better than my Ukrainian.
Dr. Henry Marsh, thank you very much for your lecture. And thank you all the involved to make it happen. And we look forward to see you once again in UKU. Also, також, якщо ви ще не маєте книжок Генрі Марша, ви можете їх придбати і отримати авторський підпис.
Де можна придбати, ви сказали? Наверху, там ще є на